My name is Szymańska, and I work as a 2D artist and marketing manager at the Farm 51, where I've been working for almost 3 years now. Okay. And during the development of Gidiven, I was responsible for making, well, almost all of the story notes, 2D story notes for the game. And, well, at this point you might think, why the hell would you need a person dedicated to make story notes, right? Because it's, well, how much work can it be? A week, a couple of days? Well, this can be the case if you make, let's say, dozens, 30 story notes for the whole game. But if you make 300 of story assets, then you need a whole team to do it. So generally, this is what I want to talk today, is how we turned story notes from meaningless collectibles to the core narration technique in our game, and what was the role of the 2D artist in the process, and how important was teamwork to achieve success. But first, let's just take a, Let's just take a very quick sprint through some, let's say, theory, right? So the most common methods of storytelling in games are, first, cutscenes, which give us the cinematic experience where the player becomes the director of his own movie. It is his decision whether the character says this or that, whether he kills another character or not, whether he trips or not. And this gives a maybe more whole experience of the player, and obviously maybe it's the most effective way of storytelling and the most straightforward, and on the other hand, it's the most expensive one. Then we have dialogues, which mostly expose the character. Also on the later it exposes also maybe more the setting or the story, and sometimes the player has to understand the story between the lines, between the dialogues, and usually they are presented in voice by voice actors, and also in writing, and this type of narration is obviously present in almost all types of games, regardless of their budget. And then we have environmental storytelling. We had a very nice presentation an hour ago about environmental storytelling and how to build through level design, you can tell a story. And this is the first, let's say, type of environmental storytelling through level design. And it's not only the small stories that you find on the level, it's sometimes the whole level. For example, when you have the game like Fallout, you see that the world is destroyed, there has been a nuclear disaster, and people live in a post-apocalyptic world. And in some places you find scenes like this one, where you just think, what happened here? Who was this person? How did he die? And what was his last moment? How his last moments look like? So the player connects the dots himself, and he tells the story himself. And then we have story notes, the last method I want to show. Generally, story notes are treated as some more or less meaningless collectibles, where the players can find some side story elements. Very rarely you can find some core clues for the story or the core elements of the story. And again, some games do show some important clues, and which help the player to predict what is going to happen. And these games are Until Dawn, like here, and the subject of our lecture today, Get Even. And since the lecture is going to be about story and story notes, so spoiler alert, feel yourself warned. So now let's move to story notes as a part of Get Even's game space. So when we designed how to tell the story of the game, we decided to divide the story in two parts. So it would be told with direct and indirect narration. Direct narration was obligatory, which was presented through either cutscenes or dialogues, so the player always was exposed to it. And for example, during dialogues between black and red, so the main character, during loading screens, or the player met characters on certain levels in certain places, which also gave some key elements of the story. So, so if the player paid attention to all of these key elements, all these cutscenes, he could understand the overall image of the game. But then we had the indirect narration, which was told through level design, through story notes, and it was optional. We call it indirect because the player had to search for all these pieces of evidence, for all these pieces of the story himself. So it wasn't given straightforward to him. He had to put some effort to find it. And why we did that? Well, generally, our goal was to turn the player into a detective, because the main character is Coal Black. He's a hired gun who is hired to save a girl, save a kidnapped girl. Unfortunately, he couldn't do that. He fails his task, and then he wakes up in a strange place. He has no idea what happened to him. He has no idea where he is, and he has to figure it out himself. So the player and the main character are trying to put the pieces together as a team. So, so the player was looking for evidence, and now I want to show you a small, short video. Full screen. Thank you. So we have the player with this high-tech phone with various applications which help him to explore the world. And one of them is the scanner, where when you find a piece of evidence, you take a picture of it, and then the voice in the phone tells you what did you find and what kind of a clue there is. And so the player just progresses through all the game and searches for another evidence, even more, and sometimes these evidence trigger elements of the story. So characters talking together, and when he takes pictures of all these evidence, they are all gathered on evidence boards. So the player could see his own progress. So he can see every picture he has taken is always on this board. And all these elements, like on the screen, are collected in specific groups and which have specific relations. But more about that later. But first, I would like to also talk about the influence of level design on the notes, because generally the process of preparing story notes was from the beginning a very close cooperation between the level designer, writer, and the artist. So it was first the level design which decided whether it's a police report, whether it's an email, whether it's a newspaper. So the designer had to think what would be the best way to tell this piece of story at this specific place. Also, these notes gave additional information, for example, like the date in the news article, which could determine the timeline of a certain event. They were also adjusted visually to the level. So for example, if we found a note in an abandoned asylum, like here, it was adjusted visually to the level. So it was destroyed, it's old, it's written, for example, with a typewriter. So everything had to blend together in order to make everything convincing. Sometimes they triggered events on the level, but this was something rather side. And sometimes were shown in pieces to evoke curiosity. So for example, the player found one piece of an email, he could read only half of it, and then he was even more curious what's in the rest of the email, so he was searching for the other part of the puzzle. So, before everyone wants to do any task in a game, or in any creative task, he should do his research. And I know it's obvious, right? Everybody talks about research, but it's still something that people do forget. It's like also my colleagues before told in the previous lecture. So Captain Obvious strike one, whatever you create, first look for references. So if you don't know how something looks like, look it up in the internet. If you think you know how something looks like, look it up twice. Because the devil is always in the details. And details are those tiny little bastards that can make an asset convincing or not. So let's say you have to make a police report. So you think that, well, it's just a piece of paper, right? And documents always look the same. They all have text and tables, but it's not the case. For example, police reports have very complex tables with lots of text. They have stamps here and here. They have signatures, sometimes notes written by hand. Some things are crossed out. They have, when you have a database, criminal database, you also have the mugshot of the criminal, of the suspect, and his personal data and some criminal history. So these are all the elements that if you forget to include them and to prepare them with the proper layout, it will be less convincing. So it's not only it's not enough to just find the reference. You have to analyze it, look for the details. Sometimes even things like here, if you probably these are just meaningless text for the player, but if you just ignore certain elements, the asset will be less convincing. So once you've done your research, then you move to execution. So just a small hint, this is from the game, in case somebody didn't notice. When preparing police reports for the game, I tried to transform all the elements, all the details I found in my research. And also, obviously, it's not only the artist that has to do the research in this case, but also the writer, because if he doesn't prepare the text properly, obviously you can't create anything convincing if the text is not convincing and it's not prepared properly, right? So here we have, for example, the name of the police department, what kind of a document it is. You have a criminal record database printout, you have the mugshot, you have the arrest record. Or when you have the incident report, you have the date, the number of the file, when was it filed, stamps, everything. So with all these elements, the player can see that, oh, it looks like really a police report. Then a next example is maybe more vivid, newspapers. Well, when you think of a newspaper, probably you're quite certain that, oh my God, obviously everybody knows how a newspaper looks like, right? Well, again, it's not that easy, because when I was told to prepare a newspaper, my first question was, what kind of a newspaper is it? Is it a tabloid? Is it a magazine? Is it a quality newspaper? So these type of assets differ enormously. For example, when you have a tabloid, it uses enormous fonts, usually white or yellow on a black background, so the article screams from the paper at you. And when you have a quality newspaper, but still a newspaper, the layout is, well, more balanced, but still it has tons of information squeezed everywhere. And when you have a magazine, obviously you have high quality pictures, definitely bigger pictures with less information, and the layout is always more sophisticated. And also the question is whether it's a front page or not, because when you make a front page, you have to pay attention to making all these advertisements, name of the newspaper, price, probably a QR code or something like that. When it's a piece of a news from inside the paper, you don't have to pay attention to all of those details that much. And also if it's modern or not, because newspapers also change their layout throughout time. So back from the research, let's go to the implementation. So me and the writer at some point even decided to create our own brand of quality political newspaper, quality political magazine, come up with a name for it, design the layout, so the player, it's not the only asset this type that player finds. So also we build some visual connections with it. So as you see, we have a typical layout for the quality newspaper, quality magazines. Very often they use red color. The title is very well highlighted. Then we have a tabloid. So again, the text is shown on a dark background with very huge fonts, and also the text itself is written with bigger fonts. It also happens in tabloids because they tell less information, but they are trying, to make some cheap sensation. And then we have a local daily newspaper, which very often are not that well designed. To be honest, they look ugly. So in order to make an asset convincing, you have to make your assets still ugly. So with some cheap, ugly advertisements, and with the layout not that interesting. But still, it looks immediately that you have a cheap newspaper in your hands. So in order to maybe highlight what I meant is just let's make a small case study. We have the same asset in two versions, and think for a while which one is more convincing for you, either the left or the right. I think most of you think it's the right one, but why is that? Well, this is like a wannabe newspaper. It's kind of trying to be a newspaper, but it still lacks some of the elements. So, for example, the font used in the title is the same as the of the paragraph. Nobody does that. The spreads are not properly done, so they are not symmetrical. There is no lead and also no author, which is also quite common in newspapers, that articles do have authors, right? Somebody wrote them. So first, it's the fact that it's convincing or not, but thanks to this kind of a layout, when a player finds a tiny note, a tiny piece of newspaper on a desk, it's easier for him to see it among all the assets, all the meshes on the level. And it's enough for him to read the headline and the lead to know more or less what the article is about. So we don't force the player to read everything at this point. If he doesn't want to read everything now, it's enough for him to read this, and he will know more or less what it is about. The same suggestion could be used, for example, for handwritten notes, which is my second example. So how can you make handwritten notes in a game? One way is to take a pen, write it yourself, scan it, make a texture, and then it will look pretty, it will look very convincing because actually it is handwritten, but from the production point of view, it's extremely expensive and and when you have to make some corrections afterwards, or let's say the text changes, well, it could be very painful and not worth all the money spent for it. So we had to make a compromise, because in GetEven we also had dozens of handwritten story notes, and we had to figure out something. So we decided to use a font. But when you use a font, it's the same case as the newspaper. It's not enough to take a font that looks like a handwriting. It will still not look convincing. Why is that? Well, it's too perfect. Nobody writes like that. The baselines are perfect. The vertical and horizontal baselines are perfect. Every letter is the same size. So the DD here is the same. The LL is the same. So I will give you $5 if you can find me a person who can write like this on a clear sheet of paper. I'm sure that you cannot find anyone like that. So in order to make an asset with the use of a font more convincing, try to break every regularity. So break the baseline, break the character size locally. Also break the spacing between the letters. So because also this is something that you don't write every letter with the same space between the signs. You just write sometimes more widely, sometimes you squeeze more, especially if you're lack of space. So this is, of course, not perfect, but still it's more convincing than this one, and because it tries to imitate handwriting. And in the game, the players sometimes couldn't tell if it's a handwritten note or done with a font. So it turned out quite well. But making an asset convincing was not enough for our game, because when you make when we face the thought that we have to make hundreds of story assets, we have to think of creating some connections between them in order to make them attractive to the player. So again, maybe a movie time. So at some point of the game, the player is taken to an evidence room.
Consider this a file cabinet, Mrs. Black, of all the evidence you gather. They'll make sense of it eventually. Any information filed by Pandora is accessible to you in this room. Each board represents a different memory. Give it a try. Look at a couple of boards and see what happens.
Okay, so when every piece of evidence the player finds lands on the evidence boards. So this is one way of showing him his progress and which pieces of the puzzle are missing. And maybe we'll come back a bit with the screen. Right. So if the player was missing an asset, he will just have a blank spot here. And thanks to these lines that we used, very similar to those which you can see in detective movies and police crime stories, that they create all those evidence boards with all these strings connected to each other and trying to figure out what's going on. And here is similar in GetEven. And when you find, and when you see that, for example, this picture is missing and it's connected somehow to this and to this, you will even be more interested in looking for the clues that are missing. Coming back to the presentation. So this was one of the methods to create connections between the notes, and this was the designer's part of work. And you can also build connections on the notes, on the story assets themselves. For example, here you can have a similar quality of the paper and similar quality of the printouts with some broken printer. Obviously, the police department is not that rich to buy new copy machines. So now let's move to Captain Obvious for a moment. And strike two, always try to make the asset eye-catching, because so the player won't miss it or ignore it. So because when you have, let's say, again, 10, 20 pieces of paper in a game, when a player finds something like this, it's obviously he would be interested, because it's not that, it is something uncommon. But when you have hundreds, again, of pieces of paper, you have to bend over backwards sometimes to make it attractive to the player. But remember, when you're trying to make the asset attractive visually, don't overdo it, because if your goal is to make the assets convincing and you will do too much to make it visually attractive, it will stop looking convincing. So for example, you have an email hard copy. For me personally, it was the worst asset ever I had to make, and I had to make again dozens of those, because they have tons of text. Rarely they have anything interesting visually, and if you look at the whole, you cannot tell what it is about, anything interesting there. So this is what the research says, and the research says it's boring. So the player will not be interested, and he will just skip the asset, will not read it. So what to do in order to make the asset more interesting? Create visual connections. For example, I decided to, when you have corporate correspondence, obviously there will be also always the corporate logo. The addressee will be visible at first spot. And also I decided to create some certain layout which would be consistent. So when a player, for example, finds a letter MA like this, and then he finds the next one, he may get interested because, oh, here's a logo that I saw before, or here's the, I've seen this person, I remember him from somewhere. So when we make these connections here, then the player is happy. So how can you make connections in other types of assets? For example, when you have handwritten notes, they are trickier, because you cannot use fancy logos here or create quite very interesting pieces of paper or something. So you have to try in different way. For example, obviously when you have a handwriting, you can connect with the same paper. So we have a certain notepad, and we have another page from this personal notepad. Or we can use the same handwriting. So you can see that this was written obviously by the same character, and this here also. Maybe the same pen, with same color, same style of writing, so we have all these frames here. Or similar add-ons like creepy drawings or something. So obviously you can see that these come from the same source, these come from the same source. So when the player finds, again, another note like this or like this, and he remembers the previous one, he might be more interested in reading what's written there, because it's another piece of the puzzle. So when talking about handwritten notes, you probably noticed that there is also lots of information that you can add to them visually, you as the artist, to make a difference and tell a story between the lines. So it's not only the story that is in the text, it's also what is in the image. So Captain Obvious, strike 3. Communicate with your team, because what you can achieve a lot of things, but only if you communicate with your team. So if you have let's say the designer does his own work, the writer does his own work, and the artist does his, and they don't communicate at all, it would be very difficult to create a convincing asset. So if you don't know all the details about the task you're given, or you have your own ideas that you want to discuss, just go and talk to people. Really, it's not that difficult. But clearly, still, it's very not that common among the team, among the game developers, to really work together as a team. Everybody is focused on their task, and they just don't, and they just pay attention to other people. So when you, for example, when I was given a task that I didn't know everything about, I went, for example, to the writer. So my first handwritten note was just a note that is telling this or that. Okay, but my first thought was, who wrote it? Who's the author? So I just went to the writer and asked him, who is the author? So after a minute, he told me who is the author. And when I asked him if we have a specific handwriting for this character, he just looked at me and just, you know, he had no idea what I was talking about. So generally, thanks to this communication, you can achieve the best results. And why is this handwriting important? So, of course, you can have random handwriting and handwritten notes in a game, obviously. When you have 1 or 2 notes like this, even 5, maybe 10, it's still not that big a deal, right? Maybe with 10 it can be a problem. But, or when the note is written by the same character, it also, the style of writing is not that big problem. But when you have, let's say, 50 handwritten notes and they all look the same or they look random, the player will get confused. So he won't know what's going on, which is connected to what, and he will simply get lost. So I decided to create a, let's say, as a standard, that every handwritten note must have an author, and that author must have a certain handwriting. So, for example, this was written, for example, by a male, which we don't have that quite lovely handwriting. Unfortunately, men quite often do have a ugly handwriting. Sorry, guys. Women usually have quite nice handwriting. Also, you can see that it could be written in a rush, and in some kind of a personal notepad. Here we have also a male with a very distinct style of writing. It all looks creepy, quite chaotic, also from a personal notepad. And if you find this note in an abandoned asylum with all these creepy drawings, it's obvious for you that it was written by some kind of a lunatic. And the third example is a note obviously written by a female, not only because of the nicer style of handwriting, but also because of the flowers. Probably men would never write on such a piece of paper unless they are forced to do it. So, but the last note here is a quite unique example, because these notes were one of the very few that were also had voiceovers added to them. So movie time again. It will be very, very short this time. Sorry for the camera movement, but so when the player approaches a note, okay, so when you have all this, you don't see it here, but it's a very, very nice, abstract, cozy home from a memory. And you have all this warm and lovely music, and you approach the note, the music turns louder, and the voiceover starts talking. So you see what is written, you hear the voice of a woman talking, and you can feel all the love and rainbows pouring from the note. So you can obviously even experience a single note more than just approaching it, reading it without any thought. So generally, that was the idea, that we wanted to make all our notes like this. but about this in a moment. So maybe just draw back slowly to conclusions. So as you can see, all the assets that were done were prepared with very close cooperation between the designer, writer, and the artist. So so sometimes the writer had to ask the designer, and the artist asked both of them. Usually it was me who was connecting those two guys, because not only sometimes they didn't talk, and there were some misunderstandings. And if I didn't go and ask each of them, there would be just, you know, situations that he had to correct his stuff, and I had to correct his stuff. So when you communicate, you just save your time, so you don't have to correct too many mistakes, and also the outcome would be always better, because sometimes the artist can think of something the writer didn't, and sometimes the designer will think of something the artist didn't. So you create your team as a whole, and that's when it could work. But coming back to the problems that we faced, because it wasn't always colors and rainbows. First of all, we had some misunderstandings, and not everybody agreed with all the effort put into story notes. Even internally, some people didn't understand, especially at the beginning part of the production. Why do we care so much about the story notes? These are just story notes, right? But they didn't see the big picture. But when they played the game and they checked themselves, that was the point when they realized that, wow, it really works. It can be amusing. Also, we had problems with the publisher. He didn't understand our idea with all of the story notes, voiceovers together, and therefore he didn't want to support it that much for most of the time. So we had to cope with what we had. So we tried to do our best to make the notes as interesting as possible with the means we had. And the last one was their marketing department, that they were just completely didn't understand the idea, because players don't read. It would be boring. Nobody would be interested. Well, it turned out that we proved them wrong, because the story and the way that was told in Get Even was one of the most often mentioned positive things about Get Even. So let's now move to a very quick presentation of the couple of reviews. So by Survivor, there's a great satisfaction scoring and exploring each room of environment for evidence and clues to understand exactly why you're here and what went wrong. Documents scattered everywhere build a better picture of the characters' relations. I myself stopped several times to read a piece of paper with pleasure, which I hardly ever do in general. The game does a great job gamifying the way in which you piece together the story, and most importantly, it really messes with your head. And the last one, all of these elements, mysteries, puzzles, notes, objects, and the environment, should feel like disparate pieces from different games, but Get Even's strongest quality is how well it melts them in context. The notes are, by accident, they are the same. It's not a bug, it's just they were 8.5 or something like that. So, I hope you like my lecture, and do you have any questions?
We still have a couple of minutes, so please, if you have any questions, come to the stage, and the microphone is waiting for you. Don't be shy.
I don't bite. Okay. No questions then.
Dun, 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 dun. Nothing? Okay.
It always ends with the microphone.
It's lazy asses. very nice talk. I didn't expect you'll focus that much on the notes. Oh, nice talk. I didn't expect you focus that much on the notes. I was expecting something different, but I'm surprised positively. And I have questions about how did you gather different styles of writing? Did you ask your friends? Do they hate you for asking you for writing on the papers?
Actually, I forgot to tell it during the presentation, but I searched for free fonts. Well, not just because they're free, but usually free fonts are made inappropriately. So when you make, when you're searching for handwritten notes, the crappier the font, the better. So because the professional fonts have everything done perfectly, every glyph, every character is done precisely. The spacing between the letters are done precisely. So when you download a badly prepared font, some of the work is done for you. So sometimes the fonts have broken baselines, or they have different sizes of the characters. So this is the way, for example, you can save some of your time.
Another question? Yes, I can come to you. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Okay, so I think this will be all for this lecture. Once again, thank you, Barbara, for sharing with us this information. I think every scavenger who is a hidden scavenger inside of us, as we are players, will play differently, at least get even, not to mention other games. So thank you very much.
Thank you.